huge thank you to Darcy and Noah, recent graduates of St Peter's, now pursuing their own vocational acting training at RADA and the Royal Welsh, respectively. It's a treat to have you back with us, and I know that we're going to watch your futures with pride and interest. And welcome back and welcome in all, friends, old members of the college, Shakespearean enthusiasts, and any number of random others who one way or another find yourselves in the happy orbit of St Peter's. Here's to a jolly afternoon ahead, and for the long stayers, a splendid gala dinner later in prospect as well. But to business. We are here to celebrate a special volume, one of the most influential books ever to be published in the English language, for reasons that we are going to explore together. And this is the moment to do this. This is the anniversary year, 400 years since its first publication. And so the time is right for us to ask together what all the fuss is about. And there has been plenty of fuss. Not many books, for example, have inspired monuments in their own honour, but this one has, and we can take this as just one indication of the strength and power of the aura that has grown up around it. We're going to return to the names memorialised with the book in this particular monument in due course. I'm going to mostly refer to the book as the 1623 folio rather than the first folio as a title, since of course it only acquires its ordinal designation in retrospect once subsequent editions appeared. It only became the first folio once there was a second folio published, as in fact there was in 1632. So for example, this particular volume, it's slightly dark, but inscribed in the binding there it says First Folio Edition, reveals the fact that that binding cannot be original by virtue of the fact it's announcing itself as the first folio. And in fact, that is true of nearly all extant folios. All bindings are unique because choosing how to get it bound when you bought your copy was a separate transaction from buying the 900 pages, if 900 pages you bought, of the book that was ready for binding. So there were pick and mix options available according to taste. And so it is that every surviving copy is different in some way, in its exterior at the very least, and that one of the things we're going to be looking at is some of the ways in which there are some interior differences that can be eloquent and revealing as well. So some bindings would have been in plain pigskin originals, others were more elaborate, 19th century rebindings, and so on. Now, what I'm going to be doing this afternoon is 4 different things. First of all, I'm going to be offering an overview of the 1623 folio by way of introduction. Then I'm going to be looking at some of the prefatory materials to the volume, some of the specially commissioned prefatory materials, and they themselves are interesting, edifying, and often entertaining. Then we're going to be talking about some of the stories of individual volumes. Each volume has of course acquired its own object biography as it has bowled through history since it was first purchased, passing from hand to hand. And we're going to be touching on some of those individual stories in particular ways. And later on this afternoon, I'm going to be passing that part of the story onto our distinguished guest, who is going to be talking in some wonderfully personally inflected ways about encounters with individual volumes around the world. And then I'm going to take the case of one play, and the play I have chosen to take this time is Henry V, and that this is a play that had been published previously in what we call quarto edition, I'll come back to that, and then was subsequently published in the folio edition in 1623. And that the fact that we have 2 different versions of it is also revealing. So we're going to be looking at some interesting variations and trying to work out what we can deduce from them. And at that point, I may well be asking for a few volunteers. So if it takes you a little time to kind of work yourself up to being willing to volunteer, start working on yourself now. You have a few minutes in hand yet. Good and kind people, I am looking forward to a plethora of hands going up. when I ask for volunteers. So first, some dates on which to hang other things. Shakespeare's born in 1564 and he dies in 1616. The first folio is published 7 years after his death in 1623, when former friends and fellow actors of Shakespeare gather together the plays that they have in their company holdings, in the King's Men holdings, and decide to put together a luxury volume for consumption and for marketing and for sale. Whose initiative was it to publish? The answer is it was John Hemmings, variously spelt, and Henry Condell, variously spelt. They were both actors in the King's Men. And what do we know about them? They had been with the King's Men since the 1590s, and so that they had known Shakespeare for some considerable time. The Lord Chamberlain's Men, as it was called, until 1603. It then took on royal patronage and became known as the King's Men. They would have known each other well, and they would have known Shakespeare well. Hemmings was from Droitwich and was a decade older than Condell. Condell was from Norwich, and as part of the repertory company of the Lord Chamberlain's Men and then the King's Men, they acted alongside each other in roles that probably settled down into fairly kind of standard repertoire roles for their age and particular competences. And we even have evidence of that from an unknown London playgoer who presumably saw them both perform in Ben Jonson's play Volpone, and then annotated the introductory page listing the persons of the play in their own copy of the works of Ben Jonson, in a copy that's now held at the Huntingdon Library. So you can see that the part of Corbaccio, an old gentleman, beside that, the unknown hand has written in John Hemmings, and beside Mosca, the unknown hand has written in Henry Condell. And in fact, Volpone, as you can see, is played by Richard Burbage. And that the scenes in which Corbaccio and Mosca appear together depend on some very well-rehearsed, quite sharp comic timing for that to work. So Hemming and Condell, we know, had played with and off each other on stage. And both were in due course churchwardens in the same parish church in East London. So professionally and personally, we know that they were close. By mid-1610, Hemmings had stepped back from acting, and by 1619, Condell stopped also, but they were business managers and they were shareholders in the King's Men, and so they remained crucial to its operations. Now, both Hemmings and Condell and Richard Burbage, who was the big star of the company, were all mentioned in Shakespeare's will. He left them 26 shillings and 8pence each to buy mourning rings by which to remember him. They were clearly friends as well as colleagues, and Shakespeare refers to them as my fellows. And in fact, all three of them, Burbage, Hemmings, and Condell, all had a son whom they named William. There was personal as well as professional reasons for Hemmings and Condell to be motivated to think about ways of memorialising Will after his death. And indeed, he had invited them explicitly and with money behind the invitation to remember him. By 1623, when this volume is published, when they were dreaming up the project of the folio publication, they were already quite old men by then, thinking of ways of maximising publicity and returns and perhaps legacy for their company, for their old friend, and for the times of rich and wonderful playmaking that they had lived through. Finances, how did it go down? It was probably a one-off payment to the company that was made by the publishers. It's unlikely to have been more than £50. Hemmings was the company's business manager by then, and it certainly wouldn't have hurt to raise the profile of some of these old plays that they still had in the repertoire of the King's Men for occasional revivals. It was the publishers who potentially stood to make the money. But it was a gamble about pricing against print run to cover costs of the paper and the printing, and paying the playing company for the manuscripts and any other rights issues that they had to negotiate in relation to already published copies. So Blount and Jaggard were the publishers, and William Jaggard, who was in fact Isaac Jaggard's father, was the printer. So this is the page that lists the names of the principal actors in the opening pages of the 1623 folio, and you can see Hemmings and Condell listed prominently amongst them. In fact, we know that this list of actors was not a snapshot of what the company looked like at any one time. It was a more panoptic, kind of trans-temporal vision, because Joseph Taylor replaced Richard Burbage as star actor. So this is kind of remembering some of the big names of the company who had been important across the last couple of decades. It's not a temporally specific snapshot. These are the 35 plays that are listed in the catalogue. Those 36 plays are included in the folio. So why is there one play missing? The play that is missing is Troilus and Cressida, and it was squeezed in at the last moment because there was a wrangle and a squabble going on about the rights for publication. And at the point at which they set the catalogue page, they hadn't yet resolved that, and so they thought they were going to need to go ahead for publication without Troilus and Cressida in it. They managed to squeeze it in publicly, but some of the early print run doesn't have Troilus and Cressida in, and then the rest do have Troilus and Cressida in. It's also worth noting that it doesn't include Pericles, or The Two Noble Kinsmen, or Cardenio, which is a lost play, or Thomas More. But this is being offered as the works of Shakespeare as it was understood for these publication processes. And it classifies Cymbeline in ways that we might find surprising. So these generic classifications of comedies, histories, and tragedies, and then Cymbeline is tucked in as the last of the tragedies, which is an unusual way of thinking about Cymbeline now. So 1623 was certainly not the first time Shakespeare's plays had been published. 18 of them had been published previously in quarto editions. Quarto editions were single play editions, and they were affordable. Some of them, including Henry V here and famously Hamlet, for example, had been published more than once and in competing editions. It's worth looking at these title pages in terms of what they tell us about what was important in relation to the identity of the play. So I don't know how well you can see this, but I'm going to try and read it out to you. This says, "The tragedy of Richard III, containing his treacherous plots against his brother Clarence, the pitiful murder of his innocent nephews, etc., etc., as it hath been lately acted by the Right Honourable the Lord Chamberlain, his servants." Published at London, 1597. Next, "The chronicle history of Henry V with his battle fought at Agincourt in France, together with ancient pistol, as it hath been sundry times played by the Right Honourable the Lord Chamberlain, his servants." Published London, 1600. "The chronicle history of Henry V, blah, 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 as it hath been sundry times played by the Right Honourable the Lord Chamberlain, his servants." 1608. There's more. Here are a couple more. "An excellent conceited tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, as it hath been often and with great applause played publicly by the Right Honourable the Lord of Hunsdon, his servants." London, blah, 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 1597. "The most excellent and lamentable tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, newly corrected, augmented, and amended, as it hath been sundry times publicly acted by the Right Honourable the Lord Chamberlain, his servants," blah, blah, blah. London, 1599. What might we have expected to find written prominently on these frontispieces, these title pages? Surely, a Shakespeare work might have just been able to sneak Shakespeare's name in somewhere on the title page, but no, not the case. Why not? Because that was not how ownership and authorship were primarily being thought about in relation to play texts in the 1590s. Had it been a sermon or a poem, the author of the sermon or the author of the poet's name would absolutely have been prominently featured. But a play text was owned by the company. The playwright sold it to the company and the actors made it theirs, and therefore it is being authorially designated. It is being owned by who has played it publicly, the company who played it. Things were going to change about authorial designation, but in the 1590s this was fairly standard. There was a circumscribed interest in the name of the writer for dramatic works, or certainly for dramatic works as literary objects, as these are at the point of publication. So 18 of these plays had never been previously published, 18 had been previously published, 18 had never been previously published. So without the 1623 folio, as Noah and Darcy were telling us earlier, we might never have had the following plays. And I'm just going to highlight a few. All are invaluable, but that includes, as Darcy and Noah were dueling in memory, The Tempest, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, The Winter's Tale, Julius Caesar, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, etc., etc. A world without these core cultural references that we all collectively own, share and trade. We trade our knowledge of them, sometimes subliminally, sometimes in explicit ways. What was the print run for the 1623 folio? We don't know for sure. It would have been between 750 and 1,000 copies because the Stationers' Guild delimited print runs to 1,000, but it was almost certainly at the lower end of that, so probably round about 750. And of those, 235 are known to be extant, which is actually a pretty significant survival rate for its moment. So that suggests that people knew that this was a valuable thing that needed to be protected, that number have made it through across the centuries is noteworthy. The folio format itself, a weighty volume with some kind of avoir du poids about it, was usually reserved for subjects, history, for religion, for classical subjects, subjects of some gravitas. The format of publication itself denoted something about its cultural import, and plays did not carry that cultural import. They were plays. So this is the first publication ever in the English language to devote a whole folio volume, whose format is already a mark of distinction, to theatre plays, which in literary terms had never been considered serious enough to merit such privileging attention. In 1616, and we'd already seen a little bit of annotation on a copy of this, Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's contemporary, had included 9 playhouse pieces in his collected works, but the works were more extensive than just plays, and indeed some of his contemporaries had mocked him for doing so, suggesting that he had forgotten the difference between work and play. So here is the frontispiece for Ben Jonson. This is the works of Benjamin Jonson. It includes some play text, it includes other things as well. And you can see that it's quite pleased with itself. It's saturated in classical reference. There is a quite self-conscious suggestion of erudition here. Here I am, Ben Jonson, offering my works to the world. Look on them and behold something wonderful. Compare something that is daringly stripped down in comparison. We know there's lots of classical reference in Shakespeare. Is this how Shakespeare is being offered to a potentially buying public? Absolutely not. There is something that is simple, pared down, exactly the opposite of that parading of erudition that we get through Ben Jonson. There's a kind of eschewing of all of those markers of learning in terms of how we first encounter the volume. There's actually a facsimile out on a pedestal at the front here with that famous double spread open at the front. You're very welcome to come and have a look at it afterwards. So we're going to look at that double spread, in fact. On the right, you get the famous Drewshout engraving, and on the left, you get a specially commissioned poem about it by Ben Jonson, in fact. And this is how that poem goes. To the reader, this figure that thou here seest put, it was for gentle Shakespeare cut, wherein the graver, the engraver, had a strife with nature to outdo the life. Oh, could he have but drawn his wit as well in brass as he hath hit his face, the print would then surpass all that was ever writ in brass. But since he cannot, reader, look not on his picture, but his book. So you've got this this fun kind of double relationship that you're being invited into. Look at this picture, look at this picture. Don't look at the picture. That's not going to tell you anything. You need to kind of turn forwards. There's good stuff coming. Don't dwell on the face. Let's find out what was in the mind and what poured onto the page thereafter. So this attraction and deflection of the gaze simultaneously in this kind of teasing double spread with which the volume opens. So the idea of personal authorship, as we know, had not been the defining identity of dramatic works when Shakespeare was first writing in the 1590s. But by the time we get to 1623, Hemming and Condell are very keen to personalise the product, and that the authorial connection, the Shakespeare connection, the fact of Shakespeare, needs to be wrapped centrally into the reading experience. And so they stoke the prefatory pages with all sorts of dedicatory verses and appeals to the reader to understand something about the mind of Shakespeare before you dig in to some of the plays to come. And famously, they have to the great variety of readers. They themselves, there are their names at the bottom, Hemming and Condell, they give an address to the readers to invite you to know what kind of thing you're about to read and how you should read it, and why you should be grateful for the opportunity to read it at all, in fact. So I'm going to zoom in on a little bit of this, which is, it had been a thing we confess. Can you see that? I'm going to read that to you now. It had been a thing we confess, worthy to have been wished, that the author himself had lived to have set forth and overseen his own writings. But since it hath been ordained otherwise, and he by death departed from that right, we pray you do not envy his friends, the office of their care and pain, to have collected and published them, and so to have published them as where before you were abused with divers stolen and surreptitious copies, maimed and deformed by the frauds and stealths of injurious impostors that expose them. Even those are now offered to your view cured and perfect of their limbs, and all the rest absolute in their numbers, as he conceived them, who, as he was a happy imitator of nature, was a most gentle expresser of it. His mind and hand went together, and what he thought he uttered with that easiness that we have scarce received from him a blot in his papers. I'm going to look at a couple of bits of that. It's fun stuff, and it is stuff with a very clear agenda. First of all, previously, oh potential buyer, you were abused with, we know that there have been some other publications that precede this one. You might have had an opportunity to buy a copy of Romeo and Juliet, or Richard III, or Hamlet, or Henry V in a quarto edition, a one-play, cheaper edition. So why on earth should you bother putting your hand back in your pocket to buy again? Because there was a problem with those volumes. You didn't really get the authentic thing, say the authors of the folio. They were surreptitious, they were stolen, they were maimed and deformed by the frauds and stealths of injurious impostors. And what is this volume doing? It's giving you the real thing. So it's absolutely worth putting your hand in your pocket and spending again, even if you've already spent, because now you're getting the authentic thing. And then, on the first page, of course, you're getting published according to the true original copies. There is nothing that's been sold down a back street. There is nothing pirated about these copies. We hold the authenticity and the authority of Shakespeareanness. You can trust us, his friends and fellows from his own company. And, of course, there's also this nice little injunction over here, but whatever you do, buy. You can come to your own judgment on this and that, but buy it first, because this is a blatant marketing puff. It has all kinds of good and substantial things underneath it, but there is no pretending that there is not a commercial will driving this as well. What's this last bit? Down here, I'll just read this little bit again. Even those are now offered to your view cured. If you've seen a dodgy copy before, don't worry, there's nothing dodgy about these ones. And perfect are the limbs and all the rest, absolute in their numbers, and this is the whole lot. This is the complete works as well, as he conceived them. And then this last line, he wrote what he thought he uttered with that easiness that we have scarce received from him a blot in his papers. Here begins the idea of genius, of the poet of nature, the poet who receives the muse, and it just flows through him undisrupted, straight through the quill and onto the page. It's unlikely that there was no blot in the papers, but it's a good story, and it communicates something about something that was undoubtedly true about Shakespeare, which was a kind of easiness of mind and a kind of capacity of thought and of feeling into all sorts of places that feels like it is empathetically engaged with so many people like him and not like him. Whatever you do buy, scarce a blot in his papers. This is the beginning of the Shakespeare industry in 1623. It's gone on to do all kinds of things since. It's kept some of us in good work since, hasn't it, Greg? And that we are most grateful to him, and we tip our hats to him, and you know, might have enriched the world as well. But there are moments when it feels almost entertainingly crass in what it's doing, alongside some terrific poetry as well. Survival rate, 235, I said, about known to be extant. Here's more or less a distribution for them, and that our distinguished guest is going to be able to speak to this in more detail later this afternoon. 83 of them are in the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. 4 are in the Huntington in California. 4 of them are right here in Oxford. And in fact, in celebration of the Shakespeare at Peter's weekend, one of them is out for view now in the Western Library. So either today or tomorrow you can stroll by and have a look at it. We're going to be talking about that volume in a moment. 5 are in the British Library. There's a significant run of them in Japanese universities. One of them's in Auckland, New Zealand. One of the most pristine copies of the world is at the Elizabethan Club in Yale. There are fewer than 20 now in private hands. And this is, in fact, Greg Doran and my friend and colleague Emma Smith looking at one of those colleagues, one of those volumes from the Durham University collection, and we'll come back to that one as well. And this is me at Sotheby's, New York, last year, where I was I had the privilege of speaking about a volume that was up for private sale. It's rare for one to become available. I spent a very happy couple of days in intimate kind of conversation, private conversation with that volume in order to be able to say specific things about it to interested parties. If you're interested in what it went for $2.5 million in July 2022. Right, but let's get down to basics. How much did it cost? How much might it be worth now? Here's a relative price index of a first folio, and in order to try and connect it to what might feel real, I've calculated it by how many loaves of bread it represents. I do run out of fingers and toes at some point, but it starts quite well. In 1623, it would have cost you the equivalent of 44 loaves of bread to buy this volume. So it's not a cheap book, but it might be a kind of splendid coffee table kind of thing that you might give as a gift to someone, or if you were a bibliophile or a collector, or you had a rather fine library, you would want a copy of it to be there. By 1756, its equivalent was 105 loaves. By 1790, 900 loaves. By 1850, 5,000 loaves. By 1910, dramatic things are happening to the prices of first folios, of 1623 folios, 96,000 loaves, and thereafter I ran out of loaves in my calculations, and I can only give you raw numbers. In 203, Oriel College, around the corner from here, sold its first folio to the late Sir Paul Getty for £3.5 million. There have been $8.4 million is the top price that they've gone for so far. What stories can some of them tell? I'm going to pick a few, and I know that Greg Doran is going to give us a few others later. So, this is Duke Humphrey's Library in the Bodleian, just up the road from here, and that those of you who know the Duke Humphreys will recognise those chains that hold the large, valuable volumes in Duke Humphreys, and that has long been the case. So, when the first copy was deposited at the Bodleian, the copy was first published in November 1623. By early January 1624, there's a copy in the Bodleian, and like all volumes of its size and stature, it would have been chained into the Duke Humphreys collection. This is the copy of the first folio that was acquired by the Bodleian in early January 1624, soon after its publication. in accordance with the agreement that the Bodleian had with the Stationers' Company, and was added to the chained folio-sized books in Duke Humphreys, where it was openly accessible to all Bodleian readers. Then in the second folio, the second edition was published in 1632 and the third in 1664. And the Bodleian acquired also the third edition, so the third folio in the 1660s. Soon after, they seem to have sort of done an audit of their collections and realised that they actually had the latest and most up-to-date edition, the 1664, and at this point the 1623 volume was looking a little bit passé. And indeed, why would one want to keep a first edition when you had a third edition? And so, for whatever reason, the Bodleian, clearing a bit of shelf space, sold off some of its books, including the 1623 Shakespeare Folio that they had acquired very early in its life. And it disappeared from view into private hands for 250 years. Great sadness. Until, in 1905, an undergraduate at Oxford walks into an Oxford bookseller's with a very interesting volume in his hand that had come from his family's country estate, wondering if it might fetch a good price. And that the bookseller looked at it and thought, there are a few interesting identifying features on this book, maybe we should take counsel from elsewhere. And it turned out that that volume was indeed the very same volume that had been sold off by the Bodleian in the 1660s and was now available for sale. I told you that the Folger Shakespeare Library has 83 copies of the folio in it. That's because Henry Clay Folger made it his life mission to buy up the Shakespearean literary cultural history and centre it in this extraordinary library in Washington, D.C. So as soon as it was known that there was a volume for sale, he offered £3,000 for it. Now you have to realise that in 1905, the most that the Bodleian had ever spent on any book was £300. So this was a huge challenge, and a big campaign was launched in order to buy back their own copy. And it was recognisable as a copy partly because, of course, the chain marks where it had been chained were still visible, and in fact it's one of the few copies that has its original binding still. And this is the copy that is out for display in the Western. So it's had a few adventures in its life. If you stroll up to the Western Library, you can gaze upon this very copy that has been through a few adventures, started in the Bodleian, off into private hands, and eventually, hurrah, the 3,000 matched sum was raised in order to beat off the American competitive bid, and the Bodleian got its own copy back, and maybe we have collectively learnt a lesson about first editions and third editions in the process, you never know. So that copy is available to display. What about copies that we no longer have? What do we know about what might have happened to some of them? We know of those that don't survive. One went down with the Titanic in 1912. One was burned in the Chicago fire of 1871. Edwin Forrester's home had a fire in 1873, the famous American actor, and his copy burnt up there. And then there's this copy, and this has belonged to the Durham University, and it was housed just on the right there in what we can only now, in retrospect, decide was insufficient security because it was stolen in 1998 from Palace Green in Durham. Nothing was known about its whereabouts for a decade until 2008, when an extravagant character named Raymond Scott walked into the Shakespeare Folio Library posing as a multi-millionaire who'd had the good fortune to come across an unusually rich hoard of rare books in Cuba. On the spot, he donated £2,000, possibly dollars, for the Folger, and he bought a large cake for the staff because he was carrying such an important volume that he was sure was going to excite everybody as he walked in. The Folger was both an extremely sensible place to try and get verification and an extremely stupid place to try and get it verified, because the staff there absolutely knew their way around what a first folio should look like, a 1623 folio should look like, but they also knew about all the other copies in the world, including the one that had gone missing from Durham in 1998, and they know their stuff, and it did not take them long to ascertain that the very copy in front of them was the copy that had been stolen from Palace Green in Durham in 1998. Raymond Scott was in due course arrested and convicted in 2010. And we move on. Of those that do survive, they survive in very different conditions of binding and completeness or incompleteness, of inserted facsimile sheets or otherwise, with interesting marginalia, wine stains, child's handwriting practice in the margins, dirty cat paws tripping across the pages of the copy in the Birmingham Public Library, and one copy in Japan which has a hole from a musket bullet going through it. The hole stops at Titus Andronicus, which, as my friend and colleague Eric Rasmussen says, is after all a pretty impenetrable play. Annotation in Shakespeare editions has often also been eloquent about speaking to up to its times and about its owner as well. And this is true into modern times too. You will probably know about the Robben Island Bible. So when Nelson Mandela was on Robben Island, they were only allowed religious texts, and friends therefore were able to smuggle in all sorts of other texts so long as they had a Bible cover or a Quranic cover or something to enable it to get past. And one of the things that was smuggled in was a complete works of Shakespeare under the guise of it being a Bible, and it was accepted, as a result of which the inmates on Robben Island were able to share Shakespearean bits with each other as they educated each other and kept each other going. And that actually a whole group of them annotated that complete works of Shakespeare with passages that were particularly meaningful to them. And you can see here Mandela's signature from the 16th of the 12th, 1977. And what has he put his signature beside? Which bit of text? It's a little bit from Julius Caesar. It's Caesar to Calpurnia, and that these are the words against which he has signed his name. Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once. Of all the wonders that I yet have heard, it seems to me most strange that men should fear, seeing that death, a necessary end, will come when it will come. It had resonance for Nelson Mandela, and of course for us about Nelson Mandela as well. In the copy that I spent time with in Sotheby's, New York last year, there was also quite a lot of annotation in Julius Caesar. We don't know who made this particular annotation, but this is a particular section that clearly appealed to, spoke to somebody at that point. I'm not going to dwell on it in the interest of time. There was a bit of marginalia in Timon of Athens. Timon of Athens is a play with some challenges in it about what it is to be human in various ways and what it is to suffer in various ways as well. And this marginalia at the top of Timon of Athens reads thus: "In my defence, God me defend, and bring my soul to a good end. I am sick and and then it runs out. Let's hope his soul was brought to a good end." But it's very interesting that the play that generated that thought in him was Timon of Athens. This is an interesting one. This is a copy that's in the Free Library of Philadelphia, and it has some quite significant annotation in it. And a fine scholar called Claire M.L.Bourne from Pennsylvania State University published an article about it in which she speculated variously about some of the marginalia. And then my friend and colleague, Jason Scott-Warren at the University of Cambridge, read her published article with this illustration in it. And he at the time had been working on Milton. And he said, "I know that hand. That is Milton's handwriting on a copy of Shakespeare's Folio." And as a result, Claire, who'd originally published the article, and Jason were able to establish that this had in fact been Milton's copy of Shakespeare. There's something very special about the coming together of interesting literary sensibilities in this image here. So now we're going to turn to one example of a play that is published in the Folio and had also been previously published in quarto edition. And the play we're going to look at is Henry V, and there it is in the catalogue pages. It comes quite properly under the histories. It's interesting to note the sequencing of the histories on this catalogue page. So Shakespeare did not write those history plays in the order in which the kings had lived. But they have been published in terms of the order of the reigns of the kings. And what does that do? That generates the sense that it is itself a sort of history, because it has been chronologically arranged for us. And there is something very influential about Shakespeare's writing of history, and this particular sequencing has boosted that sense that Shakespeare's writing of history kind of is a history in its own way. Had you been interested in literary sensibility, in language evolution, in thematic development of the author, it might have been more interesting to sequence them in the order in which he wrote them, and then you could say, oh, I see that image, that metaphor, that linguistic tick, that thematic ingest is coming back, or being developed, or being ironized, or being turned inside out, or being amplified across the works in this sequence. But that's not the order in which they come. Henry V, you will remember, is that play that has all of those big lines that politicians reach for gratefully and frequently. Oh, cry God for Harry, England and St. George. Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. So these lines have a kind of life of their own beyond the play. They have been used and reused so many times into so many different contexts that the play has a kind of status that exceeds its own particular dramatic specifics. Henry V was written and first performed in 1599. I cannot say what year a particular play was written and first performed in about every play with quite that degree of confidence. Why can I speak it with such confidence in relation to Henry V? How do we know it was first published in 1599? And here I refer you to the handout that should have been on your seat. If you can't see it, stand up, it's probably underneath you. So I'm going to turn first of all to the right-hand column of your first page, which is actually the very beginning of Act 5. It's just the chorus figure who kind of plays kind of a continuity role for us through Henry V. Agincourt, the English have gone to France and against the French and absolutely against the odds. They have won. And the chorus figure, who is inviting us to imagine what this moment might now be like in England, asks us to think what kind of processional ceremony and triumphalist kind of return Henry, the young King Henry, is going to receive when he takes to the streets of London on his return from having won the Battle of Agincourt and taken over the French kingdom. And he asks us to do it through two different images. Now, I've given you a few minutes to have a little think about this. I just wonder whether anybody might super generously be willing to give us a reading of this, but now behold in the quick forge and working house of thought. That speech on the right-hand side of the... Anybody generously willing to step up first? There will be others behind you, but you will have pioneer status by stepping up first. Who might be willing to do this? Yeah? We got someone? You are a complete star. Do you want to come on down the front? Or do you want to do it from there? Would you prefer to do it from there? Yes, okay. Can we get a microphone to this gentleman, please? Is someone bringing a microphone? It's on its way. Okay, we're not getting a microphone to you. Give it some. Yes, exactly. We're all rooting for you. Thank you. Yeah, but now behold.
But now behold, in the quick forge and working house of thought, how London doth pour out her citizens, the mayor and all his brethren in best sort, like to the senators of antique Rome, with the plebeians swarming at their heels, go forth and fetch the conquering Caesar in, as by a lower, but by loving likelihood, were now the general of our gracious empress,
Thank you. That was marvellous, thank you. So, this is how the chorus figure is asking us to imagine ourselves onto the streets of London and what it might have felt like in its excitement. And he reaches for two separate images to help us get there. And the first one is this kind of grand classical precedent. Like to the senators of the antique Rome, with the plebeians swarming at their heels, go forth and fetch their conquering Caesar in. But the second one is much closer to home, as by a lower but by loving likelihood were not the general of our gracious empress, as in good time he may, from Ireland coming, bringing rebellion broached on his sword. So, who's our gracious empress when Shakespeare's writing? Elizabeth I. Who is the favoured general of our gracious empress? Earl of Essex. Okay. So, in 1599, Elizabeth sends Essex to Ireland in order to broach a rebellion. We know that this happens. He's sent out in early spring, and that this little fantasy of him coming back, bringing rebellion broached on his sword, is only possible between spring and September of 1599, because by the end of September, he's coming back with his tail between his legs, having sued for an ignoble peace. So the moment at which it's possible for this to take is absolutely sometime in 1599. Okay, so we know when it's written. Moving on. This is the opening. In fact, I'll move this now. This is the opening double spread of Henry V from the Folio. It's exactly the same here and here. And we're going to look at the first two bits of it as it appears in the Folio together. I don't know whether you can see this, but at the very top it says, "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention." It's also on your paper in front of you. Now, what I would ideally like is to find 3 volunteers to do a section of it each. So now, this gentleman here has got us warmed up brilliantly out of the blocks, and we all thank you for that. There's a volunteer at the back. Thank you very much. You, sir, could you take "Oh, for a muse of fire" through to line 8 where it says "crouch for employment," full stop. You are going to employment. Is that a second volunteer, please? Right next to you, in fact, you're very close to you, a gentleman there. You're going to take it from "But pardon gentles all" through to, it's about line 15 or 16, on your "imaginary forces work," full stop. You got it? Mm-hmm. Yep. Number 1 and number 2, do you know what your sections are? And we need a volunteer for number 3 at the front here. You're going to take it from "suppose" within the girdle of these walls through to "make imaginary puissance," which is about 6 lines later. And I will pick it up for the last bit. 1, 2, and 3. Does anybody want a microphone? If you're saying no to a microphone, you have to commit to giving it some. Are you in? We're all in. Are you in at the front? Excellent. If you want to stand up and turn around when the moment comes, go for it. Okay? This is the opening prologue chorus to Henry V. Nothing has happened at all yet. A single figure has stepped out onto stage and is addressing the audience thus.
Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword and fire crouch for employment.
But pardon gentles all, the flat unraised spirits that hath dared on this unworthy scaffold to bring forth so great an object. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden O the very casques that did affright the air at Agincourt? O pardon, since a crooked figure may attest in little place 1,000,000, and let us, ciphers to this great account, on your imaginary forces work.
Suppose within the girdle of these walls are now confined 2 mighty monarchies, whose high, unpreared and abutting fronts the perilous, narrow ocean parts asunder. Piece out the imperfections with your thoughts, into 1,000 parts divide one man, and make imaginary puissance.
Think When we talk of horses, that you see them, printing their proud hoofs in the receiving earth. For 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings, carry them here and there, jumping o'er times, turning the accomplishment of many years into an hourglass. For the which supply, admit me, chorus to this history, who prologue like your humble patience pray, gently to hear, kindly to judge our play. Oh, but it's marvellous. It is marvellous stuff, and we're just going to spend a couple of minutes on it together. Oh, for a muse of fire. He wants to tell a story about two kingdoms. It's a big story he wants to tell. In his fantasy, what does he want to be able to stand for a kingdom? What would he like to represent a kingdom? A kingdom, right? If only I had a kingdom for my stage. Who does he think ideal casting for Harry would be? Harry himself, okay? Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars? I want to tell you a story about England and France. The best setting for that would be England and France. I want to tell you a story about King Henry V. The best person to play Henry V would be Henry V. He'd be really good at it. Is this theatre? No, that's not theatre. Theatre is about not being the thing itself, about being invited to bridge the difference between the thing that is played and the thing you're being asked to conjure. But he's saying, if only I could take you there, if only I could tell you this story for real. And then you get that turn, but, when our second excellent speaker picked it up. But, pardon, gentles all. I don't have a kingdom. I don't have Harry. I don't have all of those resources. In fact, what have I got? Oh my goodness, it's almost embarrassing. The flat, unraised spirits that have dared, oh, the presumption, on this unworthy scaffold to bring forth so great an object. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? With the implication, of course it can't. Or may we cram within this wood-no the very casks that did affright the air at Agincourt? Of course we can't. Oh, pardon, since a crooked figure, one little guy, may attest in little place a million, and let us ciphers to this great account on your imaginary forces work. And then it turns again. If only we had this, we don't have that. Oh my goodness, the inadequate resources of this pathetic little theatre in which we find ourselves. How can we possibly tell big story in small space? How can we tell big grand story with just a few guys running around the back going, whoa? So there is a way in which we can do it. How are we going to do it? Because we're going to work on your imaginary forces. And if you then look from suppose all the way down to the bottom, looking at the number of verbal imperatives that are flung at the audience, what is being asked of the audience? They've got to suppose this. They've got to piece out that. They've got to divide one man. They've got to make imaginary precincts. They've got to think, when we talk of horses, that you see them. They've got to deck kings through their own thoughts. They've got to carry them here and there. And what has started sounding like an apology for the paucity of resource and for the inadequacy of stage practice, ends up like a vaunting, like a manifesto of what theatre can make possible if and when players and audience decide together to collude in the project of making it happen, of bringing it to life. And so we have this extraordinarily powerful manifesto for the resources of theatre which are really here in the audience's mind. It's an amazing piece. Oh, for a muse of fire. It's a wonderful thing. And that's the opening of Henry V. And it's followed immediately, if you turn over your page, in the folio, by two bishops having a quiet conversation backstage on the edges of the court. So this is shortly before Henry V himself is about to, a very young king, is going to sweep into the court, and he's going to ask the Archbishop of Canterbury whether he can, in right and conscience, make a legitimate claim on France. That's going to happen next. But first of all, we get a quiet conversation between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Ely. Now, I would like a volunteer, please, to play, it's quite a small part, Bishop of Ely. Somebody to feed in a couple of lines. Thank you very much. Bishop of Ely is over here. Are you happy doing it from there, or do you want to? Yes, you're okay. And I'm looking for somebody who's an operator and maybe a little bit arch to play the Archbishop. Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, we have found our man. I don't know your name, sir. What was it? Ladies and gentlemen, this is Gregory Doran, Artistic Director Emeritus of the Royal Shakespeare Company, is going to be our Archbishop of Canterbury, and I think we're going to be well served in that. I thank you for volunteering. Do you want to come up? Hey, Bishop of Ely, do you want to come and join the Archbishop of Canterbury? Look, we've got a... Yeah, come. You want to stand there? Okay, all right. Bishops, do your thing.
My lord, I tell you, that self-bill is urged, which in the 11th year of the last king's reign was like, and had indeed against us passed, but that the scambling and unquiet time did push it out of farther question.
How, my lord, shall we resist it now?
Must be thought of. If it pass against us, we lose the better half of our possession. For all the temporal lands which men devout, by testament have given to the church, would they strip from us, being valued thus, as much as would maintain to the king's honour full 15 earls and 1,500 knights, 6,200 good esquires, and to relief of Lazars and the weak age, of indigent faint souls past corporal toil, 100 almshouses right well supplied, and to the coffers of the king beside, £1,000 by the year. Thus runs the bill.
My good lord, how now for mitigation of this bill urged by the Commons? Doth his majesty incline to it, or no?
He seems indifferent, or rather swaying more upon our part than cherishing the exhibitors against us. For I have made an offer to his majesty upon our spiritual convocation and regard of causes now in hand, which I have opened to his grace at large as touching France, to give a greater sum than ever at one time the clergy yet did to his predecessors part withal.
I thank the episcopacy. Thank you. That was great. In fact, here it is in the folio. My lord, I'll tell you that self-bill is urged, etc. There is a degree of anxiety between these bishops, and the anxiety is focused on a domestic bill that has not yet been passed, but that the king is warming up to pass. If he passes it, what is it going to do to the church? What is the nature of their anxiety? Shall I leave that as a rhetorical question? Shall I ask it as a real one? Why are these churchmen anxious? What are they worried about? They are absolutely worried about money. They are worried about money because they fear that they are going to have the socks taxed off them if the king is left in peace to pass this domestic bill, and that they are going to be absolutely ransacked, and they're going to be unable to do the things that churchmen want to do in order to be churchmen at that point. So, says the Bishop of Ely, how now for mitigation of this bill urged by the Commons? What can we do to kind of calm it down, to tame it, or to kind of distract from it? And what about His Majesty? Doth he incline to it, or no? And what do we hear from Canterbury? Not sure. Actually, I think he's swaying our way. Why? For I have made an offer to His Majesty upon our spiritual convocation, and in regard of causes now in hand, which I have opened to His Grace at large as touching France, to give a greater sum than ever at one time the clergy yet did to his predecessors part withal, What has gone down backstage? Archbishop of Canterbury has offered the king money in order to support a war in France, because it is cheaper to fund a foreign war than to sit still and wait for the domestic bill to be passed. Right? So that the church and the crown have together had a conversation about what sort of support might be forthcoming from the church in order to support that war in France. And then, now we know that that conversation has gone down, but it's a quiet conversation. And then in sweeps the king and asks the question. We're going to look at it very quickly now. I need a Henry V now. Ken Addison, thank you. You are excellent casting. But I'm brutally not going to let you at that whole speech. I'm going to ask you to jump in a moment. And someone to play Westmoreland. I think you have one line. Somebody for a one-liner. Thank you very much. Noah and Canterbury. Could you hold on to your Canterbury casting, please, Greg? Yep, you've got two lines coming up here. So enter King Henry V, Gloucester, Bedford, Exeter, Warwick, Westmoreland, and attendants.
Where is my gracious Lord of Canterbury? Send for him, could I thought.
Should we call in the ambassador, my liege?
Not yet, my cousin. We will be resolved before we hear of him of some things of weight that task our thoughts concerning us and France.
And
God and his angels guard your sacred throne and make you long become it.
Sure, we thank you. My learned Lord, we pray you to proceed and justly and religiously unfold why the law Salic that they have in France, or should not, bar us in our claim.
now skip down, if you would, to the last four lines. Under this conjuration.
Under this conjuration, speak, my Lord, for we will hear. Note and believe in heart that what you speak is in your conscience washed, as pure as sin with baptism.
So this is now a public moment in the court, and that the king turns to Canterbury and says, it's a serious business going to war. People will lose their husbands, sons, fathers. Blood will be shed. We need to be really clear that we are making the right decision at this point. Take this commission seriously, please, Archbishop of Canterbury. May I, in right and conscience, go to war in France? And please remember, last four lines, for we will hear, note, and believe in heart that what you speak is in your conscience washed as pure as sin with baptism. And guess what Canterbury says? After a slightly long preamble, he says, you may absolutely, in right and conscience, go to war in France. Not a stunner, given that we know the previous scene in which he said, how about going to war in France? And here's something to help you a little way on the way to do so. So at the point at which we hear Henry V saying, may I in right and conscience, we go, he knows what's going to be said back to him now. This is the performance of the justifying reasons for going to war. And that Shakespeare is doing that interesting thing that has ricocheted down the generations, which is what is the private conversation and what is the public conversation about the reasons that are cited for going to war, and they are not perfectly aligned. And we get to see that because we see the conspiring bishops, and then we see the court scene as well. And he's choosing to portray Canterbury as in your conscience washed as pure as sin with baptism, in order to validate the thing he knows he is going to say. Right, that's the folio copy. There was also the quarto copy. The quarto copy was first published in 1600, so pretty soon after first performance. And it's actually called The Chronicle History of Henry V, and how does it open? Does it open with, oh, for a muse of fire, followed by, but how now for mitigation of this bill, my lord? No, it doesn't. How does it open? Like this. Enter King Henry, Exeter, 2 bishops, Clarence. Shall I call in the ambassadors, my liege? No, not yet, my cousin. We shall blah, 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 blah. God and his angels guard your sacred throne. Sure, we thank you, and now, good my lord, proceed to tell me, may I with right and conscience make my claim on France? If you don't have the conspiring bishops, when Henry says, may I with right and conscience make my claim on France, there is absolutely no cynical filter in the audience about reading how that... He's asking the Archbishop of Canterbury because he wants to know, may I with right... It's a different kind of play from the get-go without the bishop scene in it. Interestingly, quarto editions vary in their relationship to the folio. This particular quarto is significantly shorter. So it's a quarto edition that is about half the length of the folio. This particular editorial choice, now some of the quarto editions we do think are pirated copies that have been interestingly produced by memorial reconstruction or one thing or another. That is not the case in relation to this one. What we think happened is that Shakespeare wrote the big, complicated play that he wrote and that is reproduced in the folio, and he gave it to the company, and they said something like, "You've done it again, Will, it's great," and everything, terrific stuff. It's a little bit long, for the 2 hours traffic of our stage. Would you mind if we just, maybe you'd like to be involved, don't know, that we cut it down a little bit? And then they had to make some editorial choices about how to cut it down. And there's a very consistent editorial line has clearly happened in how they've cut it down, because whenever there's something that might be dishonourable in the English, or treacherous, or a little bit complicated, or cynical, or bad behaviour, or in any way tarnishes the heroism of the play, which is the thing that politicians want to remember about it, although actually it's a much bigger, more complicated play than the one people choose to remember, those bits have gone. And so the play that is left in the quarto edition, for those of you, for example, who know the 1944 amazing Olivier film of Henry V, which is doing its job at a wartime moment in order to speak to and for home front morale, so with a very particular political agenda in play. It wasn't the only way in which Olivier thought about that play. In the 1930s, he played it on the stage as a kind of angst-ridden, self-interrogating Henry V. Olivier could play it in different ways, but for 1944, there was a very clear agenda about what to do with this play, and he did it. In fact, the quarto had done exactly that in 1600 as well. And for those of you who remember the Olivier play, there's a moment in the very early seconds of the play when a playbill comes fluttering in from somewhere and slaps up against the camera lens. And if you look at that playbill, it actually says, "The Chronicle History of Henry V." Bear in mind that the title in the folio edition is "The Life of Henry V." So it was signalling its allegiances about what kind of editorial priorities it had taken. So the shorter play, the quarto play, is a crisper, clearer, shorter. It looks in this case not like a pirated copy, but an edited down performance text. In editing the play, what interpretive choices did the Lord Chamberlain's men make? And how did this shorter edited play differ from the play that was later published in the folio? I'd love to show you some other bits of the play and what went and what didn't, but you're going to have to take it on trust from me at the moment or go and read it yourself. So what happens in the play? England goes to war with France, the Battle of Agincourt for 1415. England wins. The young English king, Henry V, emerges as a war hero. Henry V marries the French princess as part of the terms of peace. Or at least, that's one version, the quarto version of what happens in the play. Alternatively, the English king is not straight with his court about his reasons for going to war. England goes to war with France on false pretenses. There is the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. There is much brutality and dishonourable behaviour on both sides. England wins and pursues punitive terms of peace. The play lets us know that the heroism of war is nearly always deeply tarnished. I understand that in the American kit bags in the first Iraq War, there was a copy of Henry V put into those kit bags to encourage the troops. You can only hope for their sake that they got the quarto, not the folio at that point. So the 1623 folio gives us plays we would not otherwise have, and it gives us significantly enriched perspectives on some of the plays we already have had from quarto publications. Happy 400th anniversary to the 1623 Shakespeare Folio.